Okay, we've got 3 people here, correct? Okay, first I wanted to get everything straight for the rest of this course. I've eliminated 5 of the chapters there that you don't have to really read. And that's, of course, chapter 5, 6, 8, 9, and 10. So this week and next week, I'm going to try to get through the rest of the book. As far as test materials, it's just going to be on these lectures right here. So you have the guide. If you learn pretty well what the PowerPoints are there, you'll be in good shape. I'm going to use the Cengage Mind Tap material for extra credit. The little orange dots there, if you complete those exercises, we can make sure that your grade is where it needs to be. As for the lab tomorrow, I would like for y'all to do the chapter 11 lab, which is pretty simple. It's on fear and emotion. And let's see if I can get to it here. Okay, so it's this one right here, Virtual Biological Psychology Lab, Neurobiology of Fear. Does everyone see that, or anyone that doesn't? So the time in the morning, I'd like for you to complete that, or you can complete it tonight if you want to, and use the rest of the time for studying these last lectures. And before I go on to chapter 7 here, is anyone have any questions or concerns?
Do you know how to post the lecture slides a different way? It's kind of hard for me to sometimes access them through the announcements.
Okay, a different way. Did you check in Pages?
Are they in Pages?
I know at least 2 of them are, but yeah, just check there. Actually, I need to go ahead and do it now. Okay. Okay, it would be this one right here, October 6th. And that should be the link there. You want to try it now to see if it works for you? Okay, does everyone have this page here? Or anyone that doesn't? Okay, I wanted to talk briefly today about movement, which is chapter 7. All voluntary movement basically starts at the primary motor cortex, which is part of the frontal lobe right near the center of the brain. And the primary motor cortex has a direct connection with the brainstem and spinal cord, and it sends out what's known as efferent signals. Anything from the brain is called efferent with an E. Anything coming in to the brain from the outside is called afferent. And anything coming in from the outside is sensory, basically. And what's going out from the brain is a reaction or a motor signal to the muscles usually. So I'll start this little red strip here, the primary motor cortex, which is part of the frontal lobe. An important part of movement is a structure known as basal ganglia. You don't have to learn all the parts to it, but you do want to know the name basal ganglia and what it does. And basically it controls semi-voluntary movements, or if you're driving a car, it's something you learn to do and your basal ganglia takes over. You don't have to think about it. You can do that automatically. Or if you're learning to shoot a basketball or swing a bat, after a while, you don't have to think about it. It's just natural. And that again is the basal ganglia that's doing that. Sometimes the basal ganglia is diseased or abnormal and it works excessively, and it will create a condition known as obsessive compulsive disorder, where a person keeps thinking something over and over and doing the same behavior and over and over and over, and it doesn't make sense, but they can't stop doing it. But that's usually where the lesion is in the basal ganglia. So when you think of basal ganglia, think of habit. Anything that's a habit or anything that you do without having to think about it comes from the basal ganglia, which is near the midbrain, right beneath the temporal lobe. But just the general location is all you really need to know. Dopamine is the major neurotransmitter involved with movement, among other things. But there are basically two tracks that dopamine uses, two pathways. One for movement involves the structure called the VTA and the striatum and substantia nigra is where dopamine is originally produced. And the disease, Parkinson's disease, is a disease where the neurons in the substantia nigra are dying or dead, and they stop sending dopamine to the structure I just talked about, or to other parts of the brain associated with movement. So dopamine is very important in Parkinson's disease. The other source of dopamine is the nucleus accumbens, which is at the base of the frontal lobe. And it basically supplies the prefrontal cortex with dopamine. The clinical condition that is important there is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's believed that dopamine is deficient in the prefrontal cortex in ADHD, and therefore a person has difficulty organizing things, paying attention, losing things, procrastinating. And because of those behaviors, a lot of times they don't do well academically, but truth of the matter, most of them are smarter than average, and some are bordering on genius. But the problem is they can't focus their attention where it needs to be, when it needs to be. So it's probably something you'll see again in the future, the prefrontal cortex and dopamine deficiency, and of course the nucleus accumbens. You probably won't be associated with Parkinson's disease that much, but it's the same neurotransmitter, but it's just made in a different part of the brain and has a different function in that particular place. So substantia nigra and nucleus accumbens, main suppliers of dopamine in the brain. As I mentioned, the pathophysiology of Parkinson's disease is a decrease in dopamine making cells, therefore a decrease in dopamine, which is represented in the green here, and therefore there's abnormal movement such as shuffling gait, stiffness, no facial expression, and tremors. It is a progressive disease that gets worse over time. The most effective treatment is a drug called L-Dopa, which crosses the blood-brain barrier and increases the dopamine to near normal levels. But the problem is it has so many side effects that sometimes it can make things worse instead of better. The future is focused on stem cells, and maybe in the next 10 or 20 years, that will be at a clinical level to where we have an effective treatment for Parkinson's disease. But right now, L-Dopa is the main treatment. Of course, there are other drugs such as amantadine and other dopamine drugs, but none of them have a lasting effect. And this is just another diagram that illustrates the dopamine pathways. And this one is a little easier to see. And right here is the VTA and substantia nigra and the striatum. All those are important with movement. The nucleus accumbens isn't mentioned here, but we can see it would be right here, and it would be supplying dopamine to the frontal lobe and prefrontal cortex. So dopamine is the main neurotransmitter for movement in the center of the brain there. Okay, what about movement that doesn't require the brain? I chose this simple illustration here because it's something that we all are familiar with. That's why we touch a hot stove. Why do we jerk away? It's not something we have to think about and say, oh, this is hot, I have to remove my hand. Even if you don't think about it, it's going to happen. And this may look a little complex, but it's really simple. There are pain receptors in our skin, and when they are triggered, they enter the spinal cord through an afferent nerve. The neuron body is right outside of the spinal cord. And once the axon connects with an interneuron within the spinal cord, it connects it to an efferent neuron and nerve. And remember, efferent is motor, and it sends a signal to the muscle to contract. And that happens without the brain being involved at the beginning. But if it did not happen, or we didn't have that reflex, life would be much more difficult when we come in contact with things that could be dangerous. So there are reflexes in every muscle. There are receptors in the tendons that make the muscle react without thought from the brain. And in all movements of the body, there are basically 3 types of muscle that you need to be familiar with. There's a smooth muscle, which mostly is in the digestive tract and respiratory tract and the blood vessels. And these are not voluntary muscles. They're not involuntary muscles, or they function automatically. You don't have to think about it. So they are involuntary muscles. A cardiac muscle is in the heart, and it works pretty much on its own. Once it gets an electrical stimulus, it beats for your entire lifetime without stopping. And the muscle we think of most when we're thinking of muscle is striated muscle or skeletal muscle, which usually is voluntary, and it involves some type of signal from the brain, as well as being reflex activated through the reflex system. So there's really not a lot to know about these types of muscles except what they are and where they're located, and that they have a close relationship with the nervous system. So in review, primary motor cortex is where motor movement is initiated from, and it happens even before you can think about it. When you decide that you want to walk across the room, it begins to be activated. And the cortex has a direct connection with the brain stem and spinal cord, where all of the reflexes take place is in the spinal cord. Basal ganglia, important part of movement, and it is mostly muscle memory and you doing things without having to describe it or think about it. just happens once you learn that particular movement. And that includes things like sports and driving a car and other things that you do without really giving it much thought, even walking. Dopamine is the main chemical we want to remember today, and it has basically two roles: a role in the striatum and the movement parts of the brain, and as a role in the frontal cortex in focus and concentration. So most neurotransmitters have more than one function, but usually they have one main function that it's known for. But neurotransmitters either excite or inhibit. It just depends on which pathway they are involved with. Again, you probably want to remember Parkinson's disease by just knowing what is going on there. Is a certain part of the brain that makes dopamine is no longer making it. And because of that, a person's movements become abnormal. And it's a progressive illness that gets worse over time. And we're hoping that one day we have a cure for it. But right now it's mostly symptomatic treatment, and it is not reversible at this time. The other condition dopamine's important in is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. If you go into psychology, social work, you're going to see that everywhere. It's the most common diagnosis in kids and many adults. It has a hereditary pattern of getting the disease. So if both parents have it, then the child probably has about a 50% chance of developing it. And depending on how much you know about genetics, closer related to someone, the more likely you are to inherit that gene. But it is the most common disorder that we see today in school-age children. And of course, the treatment is actually amphetamine and Ritalin. There are a few non-stimulant treatments such as Strattera, which increases the norepinephrine and down the stream increases the dopamine, whereas the stimulants directly decrease the availability of dopamine in the synapse in the brain. And it is basically a safe treatment. Stimulants have been used for 60 years or more. And the only real concern there is major loss of appetite, or if the young person has a structural cardiac defect, it could precipitate an arrhythmia. That's actually rare, but it's something you have to look out for, because it's probably the most dangerous thing that can happen there. And just understand the difference between a reflex, which is initiated by receptors in the skin instead of by the motor cortex. So it has to be some input there before reflex fires, but we all have reflexes and they have a role in evolution of helping keep us safe. And just remember the three types of muscle: smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and striated muscle. Striated muscle is mainly involved in voluntary action, and the other types are involuntary, that they pretty much work automatically without us thinking about it or any input there. And that was really all I wanted to go over for Chapter 7, Movement. Does anyone have any questions about that or any comments? And does everyone understand the assignment for tomorrow? We're going to do the
virtual lab.
virtual lab in Chapter 11. And it's pretty simple, but you have to actually do it. And that will be part of extra credit there if you find out you're needing any. Exam's going to seem kind of long, but the questions are very straightforward and very simple. And you have a couple of hours to complete it, but it won't take that long. I think some of you might have it done in 30 minutes. But that's all I have today. Anything from anybody? If not, I'm going to see you on Tuesday and we'll begin to start wrapping things up next week. If you have any problems, questions, concerns, just shoot me an email and I'll see what I can do. And I hope y'all have a good afternoon. Okay. And also this lecture was recorded, and I think the two before were, if you want to go back and review them. Okay, let's see, it was 4 of you here today. Zakaria, Igana, Shakur, and Audrey. Okay, and see y'all on Tuesday.